Thank you all for being with us. There's so many things that are frustrating and hard right now in the world, but one thing that I'm thankful for is the ability to use technology to provide good information to folks wherever they are. So welcome to the, let's see how many we have, 178 folks who are currently logged in for the next hour together. We're going to be talking today about disclosures. Every Wednesday we are doing different workshops. They're either where we either do them live like today, or we pre-record them and have them available on our web library. If you haven't checked out our web library at zeroabuseproject.org, please do. There's a lot of good content there about online safety during the pandemic, adverse childhood experiences, how to talk to kids about pornography, just a wide variety of different safety videos for professionals and parents. So you can take a look at that after we are done as we launch into this information. My name is Alison Feigh. I am thankful for my ability to serve as the director of Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. I've been with JWRC since 2001, and we are a program of the Zero Abuse Project. So whenever we talk about child abuse, whenever we talk about child maltreatment, I always want to anchor it in prevention, because I feel like that there is so much that we can be doing for prevention as we talk about any issue that comes through. And so, I apologize here. Someone's asking, ooh, let's do that. 1 second. Someone is asking if we're in a different time zone. It is 10 a.m. here in Minnesota, where I am. So when we talk about prevention, we want to think about it of anything that we're trying to prevent. We want to think about it holistically. So today we're doing the work of educating providers, promoting community education. We want to be thinking as we're learning information about how might this impact the policy of the faith community that I belong to, or how might this impact the policy of the place where I work? How might organizational practices be changed where I work to help make disclosures easier for kids? How can I have coalitions and networks that I have relationships with before there's a problem so that I can reach out if I need some extra help? So when we're thinking about disclosures, today we're going to be talking a lot about providers and what providers need to know as much as we can in an hour. This is, as you all know, for folks doing this work, we could spend a week talking about disclosures. And so we're going to be doing some of the high points today, but being aware that we always want to be thinking about this holistically and how can we help folks. For example, in my missing child world, I can go into an elementary school and do our Empower Me program and talk to second graders about their bodies. But if I don't have the organizational practices where the schools knows what to do when they have a disclosure, when we don't have policies about and child advocacy centers that are, where the child's only interviewed once, that disclosure becomes much harder for that young person to deal with. So always thinking about holistically as we think about prevention. And then the one other thing I'll say, two other things I'll say before I really launch in. One is just a self-care reminder. We're talking about child abuse, we're talking about child maltreatment, and because we have an hour together, some of it will go fast. And so I don't want to have people feel like that they are needing to catch up with some of this stuff in a way that when they're not feeling safe in whatever way that might be. So if you need to stand up to learn, no one is going to be judging you, because we can't, that won't be distracting at all. If you need to take a break, if you need, we never know what trainings are going to hit us in certain ways and which trainings we need help unpacking. And so if at any point this becomes, we're going to be talking today about disclosures and a lot about prevention, so it tends to be more hopeful, but you never know what may be an issue for you in your body. So if at any point you just need to step away, you have my full encouragement to do that. And as we think about this work, just keeping in mind that there isn't one solution. Most problems are multifaceted. Most problems require a lot of different people around the table on a multidisciplinary team thinking outside of the box. And so when we're thinking about disclosures, we want to be aware that there's so many different factors that are going on when a child discloses. So if I say, here is one thought, that might not work for everybody. It depends on the child's personality. It depends on the structure of the family. Depends on how the community influence happens, the cultural, societal attitudes. And so we want to work to get rid of the barriers for the kids that disclosing is easier, But we also know that there's a whole bunch of different dynamics at play, and each kid is practitioners can expect to work with kids, adolescents, and adults who have withheld their disclosure or who have attempted to tell without getting a positive response. And so being aware that you may be talking to two children from the same family who have had very different experiences in being heard and being believed, or two children from the same family, one of whom has a healthy adult, like a soccer coach or someone who has responded and is advocating for them, and someone else not having that sense of being believed and being respected. So even when we're thinking within family dynamics, we want to be thinking about this. There isn't an easy, here's the one size fits all when we talk about disclosures. So I just wanted to remind folks of that as we think about this. So the first part of today is, do kids tell? I'm lucky enough in the work that I do to spend a lot of my times at PTA meetings, at ECFE meetings, at faith communities, and that helps ground me because as someone who's, as I said, I've worked for Jacob Learning Resource Center since 2001, and so I sometimes see the world just from my perspective of everyone doing the work, and I sometimes forget the myths and the experiences that people have coming to learn this information for the first time. And one of the myths that we kind of work to unpack is this sense that parents feel like if something ever happened to my child, they would tell me. And that's not always the case. I don't know if any of you watched, if you haven't yet, the documentary, I believe it's called Rewind. It's currently on PBS on their website for free, as a free viewing for the next, I think, week and a half. I saw it this weekend. It was live on PBS, but they have it online. And it's about a young man who was sexually abused by family members growing up. And he goes back to his family home videos to sort of see from an adult perspective what it looked like from an outsider, what you could see, what you couldn't see. And one of the things his mom asked him in the documentary is she said, why didn't you tell me? You know, we were so close, and I always said it was okay to tell me. Why didn't you tell me? And the response from the filmmaker was something to the effect of, when we left my bedroom after he abused me, you served him a meal. And I saw you serve him that meal, and so I figured that you approved of the abuse. And I believe the documentary name is called Rewind, and I will double check that because I don't want to give you the wrong answer. But it's currently, if you go to pbs.org, it is the free documentary offering for the month. If you can't find it, I'll have my email on the last slide. You can send me an email. I'll send you the direct link because I sent it out to all my staff. Or Mitch, actually, if you wouldn't mind looking in your emails and just putting that. So people are saying it is called Rewind. Oh, good. I'm not losing my mind. Good, good.
I will add the link in that right now.
Perfect. Adding the link in there right now. So if you need a good documentary to watch, I thought it was very well done. But he uses the example of, you know, you made my abuser a meal, so I thought that you approved of the abuse. And he's like, I wasn't even in kindergarten yet. That's how it played out in my mind. And so just being aware that even in families where kids will be supported, there are a lot of different reasons why kids might not tell. Many children don't disclose. Child sexual abuse victims, 58% delayed disclosing for 5 years or more. 20% of the folks who've been this one. In Lyon's study, it's very interesting. There's actually children who were prepubescent who came to doctors' clinics with STDs or STIs. And even when there was medical evidence of some type of abuse, they were 25% to 57% of kids still said, no, it didn't happen. And then we know that kids who make a disclosure and no one does anything about that disclosure and it's not treated seriously, 60% of them are re-abused. And so we think about what that does to a child when they feel like, okay, I've told somebody, nothing is done, and now those fears of shame and that I've deserved it, and those fears that we all carry when we don't have someone to help unpack that with us, that continues. Then we look at the fact that only 1/3 of child sexual abuse victims will tell during their childhood. I find very sad that offenders reported, yep, and over half the time a kid did tell, a person did discover that it was happening, but in over half the time no one contacted the authorities. And then from the Stop It Now research, 8% of adults said, yep, knew someone within the last year is abusing a child. And of those 8%, 22% said I didn't do anything about it. And so we know that we need to do better by our kids. We know that is important. And so and again, I've heard I know a lot of the folks when I was looking at who is signed up for the training are people who do this work. And in some ways, these are messages that you are kind of banging your head against the wall over and over again too, but sometimes just to have that chance together to sort of look at and say, to be a booster shot in our need to continue to try to do this work. So when we look at, this is just specific to the online victimization, 5% of youth who were solicited sexually where someone tried to meet them for sex online told somebody. And it's interesting when I'm spending time in the junior highs and high schools doing our internet safety program, this is one of the things that we talk about with young people and in our focus groups about why this is. And the number one reason I hear anecdotally from kids, from teens, is if I tell, I'll lose my laptop. If I tell, I'll lose my phone. And so we'll be talking later about using what if scenarios with young people in family structures and in other youth organizations. What if this happened? Because one of the things that we hear from kids, and this is anecdotal, this isn't a study, but one of the things that we hear in our focus groups is if I know what would happen if I told, it would be easier to tell. And so what if scenarios can be helpful because it's like, okay, what if someone started talking to you about sex on your phone? How could you handle that? I want you to know, I wouldn't be mad at you. I would want to know, I wouldn't take your phone away, but we'd work together to make your phone safer. Some of those questions that they don't know about. I've had young people as well when I ask, why it's so hard to tell. I had one 6th grader say, well, Alison, my parents don't know anything about sex. I was like, they probably do. They probably do. And he's like, nope, they've never brought it up. They've never talked about it. So they don't know anything about it. I don't want to be the one to teach them. I was like, oh, wow, that's a lot there. But just that idea of the what ifs, so that we have a chance to help young people, okay, here's what would happen, so that there isn't that unknown of I don't know if I would tell what would happen. There's a lot that I don't know, but I do know that if you told me that there was someone who didn't know the rules about the internet, was making you feel unsafe online, I would want to know about it. You wouldn't be in trouble. These are the things that would happen. That can help in encouraging that conversation. I do have, my junior high students do tell me the 2 suggestions for that they have when we're doing what ifs. The first one they said is please don't use real people's name because that creeps them out. If you're like, what if your soccer coach asks you to, and they're like, oh, what's wrong with you? Most people don't hurt kids, and so using real people's names can put an air of suspicion on folks who don't really deserve that. And so using categories of people. What if a coach? What if someone in our faith community? Some of those kinds of messages. And then the second thing that young people tell us is please don't make direct eye contact with us when doing what ifs. And I'm all about, the idea of that eye contact piece. It's like active listening, are you paying attention? But young people saying that's hard to talk about this when someone's looking at their soul. So thinking about times where people are staring them down versus in the car having a conversation. And then we look at research around sending sexual explicit images that, whether that's sexting behavior, this particular study, when we talk in our other trainings about online safety and the online concerns that we see, Dr. Englander looked at people who were sending sexual pictures before they were 18, and the number one reason they were sending it is they felt pressured or coerced into doing that. And then the piece so when we're talking about sexting, when we're talking about that behavior, it's not, the safety message isn't saying don't send it and having that be the end of the discussion. The safety message is talking about what consent looks like versus what coercion looks like. How do we feel in our body when someone makes us feel comfortable? How do we feel in our body when someone makes us feel uncomfortable? And so the discussion's far more around coercion and consent when it comes to prevention. And then going down to that last bullet point, now one of the youth in the study told an adult about the photo that they had received. And I think that that's also important when we're thinking about discussions around disclosure, discussions around how the online component can be different, being aware that comes up. And we look at the fact that false disclosures are rare. And so we look at, and again, people doing this work are fully aware of that, but sometimes general public folks aren't aware of that. And so just being aware that very rarely are these disclosures intentionally false. I found, we're looking at the patterns, looking at Denver CPS, 2.5% of their reports were erroneous, with 1.5% being false. And so 8 out of 551. And then I have to wonder, I'm always curious about the 8, in the sense of, is there something else going on? Is there someone else causing the harm? They don't feel comfortable disclosing about a family member, but this is a way of asking for help. Lots to unpack. And then the other piece we're thinking about disclosures that I just want to plant a seed and think about is the issue around polyvictimization, that kids who are exposed to one type of violence are at a much greater risk of experiencing additional violence. And so thinking about the fact that I'll use an example. I had a teacher call within the last year, very well-meaning, calling the hotline, wanting to make a report. And she said, the child who I'm working with is constantly yelled at and belittled by the man who lives in their house. I don't know if it's a stepfather, mom's boyfriend, and I see this and I hear this and I hear it reported by the boy, just the amount, the words that he uses to talk about this boy. And she said, I know I can't call that in because I don't see any bruises and I don't have experience with him being sexually worried about him. What else can I do? It's like, yeah, you can call that in. You should call that in. That's important to call in. Let's talk about that. Kids who are being abused in one way are often experiencing additional violence. And in our culture, we sometimes have a sense, this well-meaning teacher feeling like, well, it hasn't met this threshold, so I can't let professionals know. And what we know is that often we don't see sexual abuse, we don't see physical abuse, we may see that emotional abuse, we may see, neglect in a different way. So being aware, that we're seeing one type of abuse, children may also be experiencing other types of abuse that they don't feel comfortable telling us about yet, or don't feel comfortable having that conversation. And so a disclosure might be a disclosure about emotional abuse. A disclosure might be about physical abuse. And we may find out down the road that there's also other things going on. Even if there aren't other things going on, we want to offer that family and that kiddo support with emotional abuse, because that has its own lasting impact. So I don't want to minimize one type of abuse over another. Just thinking about the polyvictimization research and being aware that if we just focus on child sexual abuse, we won't protect the majority of children who have experienced abuse. We want to be thinking, again, as best as we can, holistically. And kids disclose in several ways, behaviors, emotions, and language, and other ways as well that I'm sure I haven't listed here. It's, working with a parent of a 13-year-old, calling the hotline saying, my child is suddenly slamming doors and doesn't want to eat, and doesn't want to be touched. I'm worried about them. Yes, there could be something happening with a sudden shift of behavior where abuse is happening. There could also be something else totally that isn't dangerous that's happening. But either way, we want to surround that kiddo with support to figure out what might be going on there. And thinking about emotions that are happening here, being aware of that as well, that the emotions might have a sudden shift. And then the language, we find with younger kids, the language that comes out is usually unintentional, but those sort of not having the ability cognitively to keep the secret in the same way that older kids may. The example that I'll give is I was training Empower Me in a school a couple of years ago, and we were talking to the elementary school students about why kids, that it's never, ever, 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 ever the child's fault, but sometimes kids feel like they can't talk about it. And so, why is that, and how can we make it easier? We're having that sort of a discussion on that. And one of the kids raised her hand and she said, well, sometimes kids don't tell because the sexual touch feels really good. And you like that it feels good, but you don't want to tell because you don't want to get the person. And that was definitely something where this child needed some services, and there was, that's not a traditional answer that a child would have in that moment. And so making sure that that wasn't where that discussion ended for that child. But just that idea of, this wasn't a pointed, I need to sit down with an adult and tell them what's going on, but through their language, thinking something is going on here that's concerning. And so sometimes we see that stumble out in kids' language when they're young, especially not as, when kids are older, being more intentional with that. So just sometimes people say, well, my kid hasn't told me that something's happening. And again, in that, I don't want to keep harping on the Rewind documentary, but I just watched it this week, so it's in the top of my head. But the boy in the documentary came to breakfast with underwear on his head that had words on it that he was worthless and a bad kid, and the parents were like, we need to get you into therapy. This is a huge shift in behavior. Something is going on, and that was in that experience of getting that extra help. He did disclose the abuse. And so thinking about what behaviors, emotions, and language may be happening. Disclosure being a process, not an event. One of the things when we're doing the education in the schools that I'll hear from teachers is, I'm really worried that we're going to be doing this work because what if a kid comes and tells me? And so we want to equip teachers for that process in case that does happen. My colleague Rita Farrell does a training called FIRST, and to help teachers and other folks with disclosures, but sort of being aware that it's rarely sort of a one adult, one moment, sit down experience, and it's usually a process with little things that you're concerned about that you see over time. If kids do disclose, they're more likely to tell a parent or a friend who's their same age. So part of prevention is helping with those friends, of being aware. Some of our most empathetic, kind kiddos get dumped a lot of things on them because they're the good listeners. And so letting kids know the difference between telling and tattling at a young age. We tattle when we want to see someone get in trouble, and we tell when we're worried someone's in over their head and someone's in trouble. We want to help get them out of that trouble. And letting kids know they don't have to take this on by themselves. I love learning from the kids. I was at one school recently, or was it a year or two ago, and I was asking the kids to tell me the difference between telling and tattling. And one of the little guys said, well, I don't know the words, but my mom taught me the sound effects. I was like, this sounds amazing. I have no idea what's about to happen, but I can't wait. And he said, the sound effect for tattling sounds like this. And he's like, the sound effect for telling sounds like this. I was like, is your mom a social worker? Is your dad, it's just that idea of, I love that idea of, for a little one, just understanding how it sounds different in our voice. But that idea about taking some of that pressure off of the friends for trying to do the right thing, that they don't have to take this all on their own. It's important when we're talking about disclosures that we're talking also about compliant victimization. And I want to be really clear here before I launch into this. There are different dynamics that kids have, as I said at the very beginning, about telling based on age, based on family structure, based on who their trusted adults are. We know that 11 to 17-year-olds are victimized at high rates. If I asked you all who wanted to relive 11 to 17 for fun, that could be its own scientific study right there. I would not do it again. And so we think about how offenders capitalize on teenagers' biological curiosity, on teenagers' need to feel loved and to feel connected. Offenders are good at what they do in looking for targets and then giving those targets a lot of attention and affection so that that child feels compliant in the victimization. This still, this does not make them any less of a victim. So I want to be careful that when I'm talking about victims who are compliant, meaning they are not telling because they feel like that this is what's supposed to happen. In some cases, they are in love with the offender. It's because the offender is good at what they do. And so it doesn't make the child any less of a victim, but we need to be aware that in compliant victimization scenarios, the kids have different needs. Kids cannot legally consent to having sex with adults or being sexually abused by adults. So the compliance shouldn't alter the fact that they're victims of serious crimes, but being aware that this dynamic is its own dynamic that does make disclosing very difficult. I had a case years ago of a prepubescent kiddo who was being groomed by a neighbor, and the neighbor took the child across state lines, and law enforcement found the child, brought her back, and her response was, well, I can't tell what he did. I can't tell him because he gave me a friendship bracelet. And for her, that friendship bracelet and having that physical symbol of their relationship was enough for her to feel like that she could keep it a secret. And so just being aware the psychological concerns with compliant victimization. People tend to imagine that the online they give the information to someone who's pretending to be a kid and they get abducted. In most of our online safety cases that we see, especially our online exploitation cases, the child knows that the adult is an adult. The child knows the adult is seeking sex. And so being aware that the needs that teenagers, and when I say teenagers, there are some 14-year-olds I would trust doing childcare for my kids. There are some 14-year-olds I wouldn't trust with a hot glue gun. So it's a huge spectrum of behaviors and needs. And sometimes it's the same kid. Often, like on a Monday, you're in a good place. On a Wednesday, let's take a break. So when I say teens, I realize that's a huge spectrum of behaviors, but being aware that different aspects of that age group, both biologically and with the social norms, puts them at risk for the compliant victimization cases of that grooming into where they believe that they're in a relationship instead of being exploited, so that they're more likely to help keep the relationship secret. So we see the compliant victimization in kids who are trafficked when the person doing the trafficking has set themselves up to be the rescuer or the savior of that kid. In the quote unquote lover relationship, we see that in the educational system sometimes with a teacher who doesn't have good intention, who's separating that kid. And one of the big prevention pieces, we'll be talking later about building safety nets around kids of who are the 5 adults they can talk to if they have a problem. And we say 5 because sometimes it's the person on the net who is the problem. We say 5 because sometimes the first person doesn't know what to do with the disclosure. We build that safety net. And one of the things we need to talk to kids about is being aware of anybody who's trying to separate you from your net. People who are trying to separate you from your safety net and separate you from the other people who care about you. That's not how safety nets work. And that isolating behavior we see in unhealthy relationships, that isolating behavior we see in domestic violence, that isolating behavior we see in our online exploitation cases. And so thinking about that isolating behavior being a concern as we're talking to young people, what does that feel like and what does that look like? And then traveler cases where someone may be chatting with a teen for hours, days, months, years, and knows that meeting is for sex. And we look at, again, that need for attention and affection, and so these young people are in a place to be where the exploitation can be easier for offenders. And so if we're asking kids to build their safety net of the 5 adults, I always want to flip that on its head and say, and as an adult, who are the 5 kids that I can be a safety net for? Because it should not be up to the child to do all the prevention work. That's not fair and not effective. So thinking about that. And for those of you who are forensic interviewers who are on this piece, my colleague Rita Farrell, who is amazing, talked about the different pieces when you're doing forensic interviews for kids who are in these compliant victimization scenarios. Being aware of our own biases as interviewers. It can be difficult for us as professionals to unpack with victims who engaged in the sexual activity because it felt good, because there was enjoyment, because I liked how this person made me feel. And so being aware of those biases and unpacking those biases before you're in a room with the kiddos so that they don't get any additional judgment from you, both for their own mental health and to not harm the interview. Being extra aware of suggestibility. If you're asking questions like, well, you must have been forced, right? Like that's a problem. And so being extra aware going into the room of that trap. Thinking beforehand, what if the compliant victim was engaged in other illegal activities as a part of the abuse? And we see this on a smaller level, with a kiddo being groomed, with me, you can watch this movie that you're not allowed to watch. With me, you can stay out late. With me, you can try alcohol. We see that kind of behavior, and then a child's worried about telling because they've already done other things with this person. And then when you amp it up to things that are actually against the law, having that conversation with your team. And then being aware of, again, the additional information when it comes to kids with the traffic, having that conversation with the parents, with your multidisciplinary team before going in the room. Sometimes home is not the safest place for the kiddo, and so thinking about those plans as well. So wanted to make sure to talk about that specific group of kiddos, because there is a huge lack of understanding. We had an Amber Alert case several years ago in central Minnesota where the child had been abused by somebody who her parents were renting a room to, and he was worried that she was going to disclose, and so walking to school, he said he'd give her a ride the rest of the way, and he drove her out of state. She was thankfully recovered, and because it was an Amber Alert, it had a lot of publicity, and that in many ways is a wonderful thing because it helps brings the awareness up. But when you're doing sexual assault advocacy, there's a very big difference between our missing child cases where their faces are everywhere, our sexual abuse cases where privacy is the number one, piece that we're thinking about. And so when we have a kiddo who is missing, so her face was everywhere, now she's home, I shouldn't say everyone, lots of people, especially on social media, feel like that they have the right to know what happened to that child and what was going on with that child because they helped be aware. And that's a whole nother training about the victim blaming that happens in high profile cases. But in this case, there was a lot of public pushback when she was recovered because, the offender didn't use a gun. The offender didn't threaten her. He just, she went, quote unquote, willingly into his car. And it's like kids do a lot of things willingly. And that's why we don't hold them to the same standards that we do to adults. And, this man was abusing this, I want to say she was 12 and she may have been 11, but this kiddo, and he needs the one who needs to be held accountable. She should not be accountable because he didn't have a gun. That's not, most of our abductions aren't something with a weapon. Most of our abductions are seduction abductions. The offender over time seduces the child so the child feels like they have to comply or that they need to comply. And so we don't understand compliant victimization. We have a lot of dynamics that need to be unpacked. So being aware that the shame and the embarrassment and guilt can be compounded when people are talking and blaming the victim for what happened. And so we need to be thinking about that when we're doing prevention as well. And then looking at how our offenders are engaging online when we think about disclosures, NECMEC's work, if you've never looked at the National Center for Missing Exploited Children as a resource for prevention, and a resource for just you as a professional or a parent, please take a look. That was my first job out of college, and I'm always so thankful for them and the work that they do. But being aware that the first thing that offenders do to engage kids is to engage the child in sexual conversation and sexual role play. And so we think about disclosures. Is a 15-year-old going to tell a parent or a caring adult, I've been talking about sex with this person? It right away gets this to the sense of who's curious about sex. Right away, it gets to who has someone to tell, who doesn't. Secondly, and very close second, asking the child for sexually explicit images of themselves. I've had cases where kids have said, well, this person sent me a picture of their penis, and they said I had to send something back or it wouldn't be fair, so then I sent something back. And so that, again, helping unpack some of that with what if scenarios before it happens. And you know what? Someone can send you a picture of them that's sexual. That does not mean that you need to send something back. And here's why this can be that isolating behavior. Let's talk about that. And so we think about the fact that offenders are engaging most by talking to kids about sex. One of the prevention pieces that we need to be thinking about is how do we provide kids healthy information about their body? Because most people use the internet well, but someone using a chat app at 3 p.m. to ask your kid questions about sex is not one of the healthy grown-ups, right? So talking to kids about, or one of the healthy juveniles, I should say, but like talking to kids about, if someone's talking about sex online, that's a huge red flag, and I want to know about it, you won't be in trouble. Some of those messages, and to get rid of some of that shame, thinking about how do we provide kids information about their bodies now in 2020. When I've done training at colleges, one of the questions that I've asked college students is, where did you learn about what healthy sexuality was when you were growing up? What did you learn about what a healthy relationship looked like? And I always used to hear, I learned about that from my older siblings. They taught me about that. I'd go to them with their questions because it was less embarrassing. And now when I ask that question in college, the number one thing I'm hearing from college students is saying, well, I'm learning it from porn. And I had one senior in high school, we were at an event having a conversation. He said, I've never been on a date. I've never held anybody's hand. So I'm watching a lot of porn so that when I do find someone who likes me back, I'll know what to do. And that, to me, pornography is a lot of things, but does it model consent? Does it model healthy relationships? Does it model what we want kids to know about bodies and health, my answer for me is that it doesn't do those things. And so thinking about, we don't want pornography to be the #1 sex educator of our kids. How can we provide kids accurate, healthy information about their bodies that's age appropriate, so that when someone swoops in on a chat app wanting to talk about their bodies, they know that that's a problem and not a good source of information. And I think back, this is dating myself, but as someone who grew up in the 1970s, the Phenomenal Kids book of Where Do I Come From? You know, with the sperm in the top hat on the cover. You may know that cartoon book if you know what I'm talking about. I didn't realize that was different from any other book on our bookshelf until my cousin spent the night. And Dad was like, "What are you guys going to read tonight?" And I'm like, "Where do I come from?" He said, "No, I don't know what your cousins know about your body." You know, like, it was just, to me, one more thing of learning. And so thinking about how offenders engage, and then thinking about how we as parents and professionals, I have a friend who's a single dad. When his daughter hit puberty, he just got a written journal. Then he said, if you have questions about your body, and if you hear on the school bus or somewhere else, you're not sure if something's true, write it in the journal, put it on my pillow, and I'll write the answer back and put it on your pillow. You never have to talk to me about it face-to-face, but I always want to make sure that you have good information about your body. And one of the things that we can do, if you're someone who's in a position of working with youth directly, is thinking about ways that with parent involvement that we can provide good information for kids about bodies. I did youth ministry for about 7 years, and every January was Sex Ed Month, and I'd make sure to put it in the church bulletin and in other publications. And I thought I'd see a lot less kids in January than other months. And I had the flip side happen, where I'd see kids I haven't seen the whole year, whose parents were like, "It's January, get going, let's." And it was a team of folks providing that information. But if offenders are using kids' curiosity about their bodies as a way to harm our kids, we need to be thinking about how we can be using that information as a way to empower our kids and to reduce some of that shame. And we know that kids who are being harmed online are often the same kids who are being harmed offline. And so, there's sort of, again, that myth or that trope about like the kiddo who's doing well in every other aspect of their life, but then they go online and this person causes them harm. And yes, that happens. What we often see more is the same kid who's being targeted by people in real life is also being targeted online. So we've talked about that most kids are telling the truth when disclosures happen. We've talked about that most kids don't tell. Let's talk about some of those barriers to disclosures. And we go into that what if scenario, the power of the what if. Fear of family rejection and fear of not being believed are major factors of kids not to tell about abuse. I'm just looking, sorry, I was not looking at the webinar chat for a while because I was on a roll. And I'm just looking here to see, people are asking if we'll have these slides as a resource. Yes, as a certificate of attendance emailed. I don't believe it is. And Mitchell, correct me if I'm wrong on any of these things. Do we have suggestions on how to ask kids about touches, since some kids say that it's okay? What we do for that, and we have a specific webinar on it that's free and already loaded up to our website that's just called Talk About Touches. We just use the phrase, let's talk about touches. I don't want a 6-year-old to figure out if something is a good touch or bad touch for so many reasons. First, because kids who are taught that are less likely to tell because they feel like they've been bad. Most sexual touch, our body does respond, so it's confusing. I don't want a 6-year-old to have to navigate that. I just want to know if someone's touching their private parts. And we can talk together and this is me talking about caregiver brain, so this is coming from that lens. We can talk together about, was it clean and healthy or not? Let's talk about touches, sort of just being the sentence there. If someone is asking to touch your private parts, wants you to touch their private parts, making sure kids know the real and accurate names for their private parts. I want to know about it. And so it's always easier with stories, I feel like, than not. But I was at a 3rd grade and a kid raised their hand and said, we're talking right now with Empower Me, which is our curriculum. There are tons of good ones out there, but we use the Empower Me curriculum. And he said, I was at my friend's house and a bee stung my butt and my friend's dad took the bee out. Was that clean and healthy? And I said, well, thank you for telling me that happens, so we can have a conversation about it, because we talk about touches and touches should never be a secret. And then we talked about, was that clean and healthy? Were you allowed to tell your parents that it happened? Did it feel like that was something that was healthy? Were you, the ice pack, some of those, and unpacking that with that kiddo. So they don't have to decide, is this something that's a problem or not? they're taught to go to the person who takes care of them, to unpack that. And if it's the person taking care of them causing the harm, helping them identify who other people are. Because if we just say, don't touch, tell us if it feels bad, we're going to miss out on most disclosures, because that's not the case with most disclosures. Is there a link to the teacher training just referenced? Again, on our webinar page, we have a Empower Me overview that goes through that, and it goes through the first training, which is the training that Rita does for teachers as well. And then Mitch is saying, I can send you the notes version of the slides, so people are putting their emails in. And someone says, yes, please don't teach good touch or bad touch. I completely and 100% agree. It is such confusing language. And so let's not have a kiddo try to figure out if this is a problem or not a problem. I just want to know if someone is asking you to touch your private parts. And then we can figure out if it's clean or healthy. Let me see here. Someone says some of these statistics are over 10 years old. Completely agree with you. A lot of the early statistics on disclosures are from older studies, and we will be getting into, as you have been watching with studies that are newer, there's going to be one that just came out this week. So it is a blend of different studies, and yes, some of them are older. Someone says, I have a traveler case. The parents of the victim are Mexican immigrants, and for the most part blaming the victims. There's a risk of pregnancy. How do I teach the parents that she's a vulnerable young girl? Do you have words of language? I would say that is when we use our resources and our connections, because when it comes to cultural dynamics, for me as a white lady to sit down with a kid and be like, here's what you need to know about how I see the world, and that's not nearly as helpful as having a community partner, maybe in their faith community, maybe as someone who does outreach, someone where they're paid for their time, and they are from that same culture, and they can unpack it with that child in a way that is respectful and culturally informed. We can do our work to be as culturally informed as we humanly can be. It's so important when we can reach out to our community partners and have somebody who they trust in a different way. That can be far more lasting and helpful than me attempting to win them over to my side, and whatever that might look like. And then someone else said, people have been getting away from good touch, bad touch. Yes, but as someone who monitors our social media, we hear it way more than we want to hear it. And then one more question for Mitch, and then I'll go back to talking. It's someone's asking, are certificates of attendance given for our webinars? I don't believe they are, but I will let Mitch answer. Do you mind, Mitch, just popping in here? And then I will.
No problem. Yep, we are not giving certificates for this webinar.
Excellent. I mean, not excellent, because we are trying to do as much as we can free and often for professionals and for folks. And yes, that is where we're at. Okay. And I'm going to move back here to the presentation, and I'll come back to the chat as we go, and if there are things that I'm missing. And so fear of family rejection, fear of disbelief are major factors leading children not to disclose abuse. So sometimes that is the power of what if, of having those what if conversations. I would want to know, even if it's someone, our kids are far more at risk by people they meet when they go out the front door to play instead of the, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Kids are far more at risk by the people we let into our front door than people they meet when they go out the back door to play. And one of the reasons kids don't disclose is if they care about and love you and care about and love the person. And so having some of those what ifs to say, I would want to know, even if it's someone our family knows and likes, I wouldn't be mad at you. Some of those messages being very important. And then helping kids who don't have that at home to have that, to help them build their safety nets of who are the people that they can tell. And in this pandemic, that's the thing that's keeping me up at night, and I'm sure a lot of you, is all the kids who are in unsafe situations that are just compounded now with isolation, with financial concerns. And our agency, Zero Abuse Project, has a document on our website, zeroabuseproject.org, of 25 things multidisciplinary teams should be thinking about during the pandemic. And it's hard, and my heart is with all of you trying to do response and prevention work right now. One of the things that prevents kids from telling is just that sense of feeling like I know a bad person when I see them, and we hear that from parents too. Well, this person seems so nice, and offenders look like people we know. I I do not know how to pronounce Ramona's last name. I want to say Alagia, but I could be wrong. Phenomenal work around just the idea of what are the barriers that prevent kids from disclosing, and then looking at each of those barriers that kids have said, this is why I didn't tell, and then flipping that and saying, well, what are the things we could be doing to make that easier? So thinking about kids who are young are less likely to tell, gender influences kids telling or not telling. And I would add to this particular study looks at men versus females, and I think our non-binary kids, there's a whole nother layer there. If I tell, will this make my shame or guilt? Is there something wrong with me as someone who doesn't fit in the male-female box? And the answer is no. But where are kids getting that information so that they also feel comfortable disclosing? Do they have a safe person to tell? The relationship that they have to the perpetrator, the internal things happening in their own life, their self-blame, their fear, their family relationships, families that have really rigid gender roles where domestic violence is happening, where there's a very patriarchal structure, they're less likely to tell. Environmental and cultural factors, if they don't know anything about their bodies, if they're passively accepting what's happening, they don't want to shame the family. So looking at those and flipping each of them on its head, thinking about, okay, well, the ability that kids will tell, the idea that kids will tell will increase with age, especially as they become adults. Being aware that there is a slight trend in older adolescent females making disclosures. Relationships of perpetrators, sometimes the relationship doesn't last forever, and so the person who the child is really afraid of when they're 6, that person moves out of the house when they're 9, then they feel comfortable to tell, and so then that rates of disclosing can increase. Biological context, having a prevention education program, having information about sexuality, having that discussion, having therapy, all good things. Family relationships, if they have support from their caregiver, the change that makes in their life. The involvement of other people, witnesses reporting, huge, again, something that's keeping me up at night is the teachers not getting to see the kids at risk. Detection through professionals and community members, and then looking at the environmental and cultural context. And so paying attention to the things that make it hard, and how can we increase the involvement of other people? How can we increase healthy family relationships? How can we support the non-offending caregiver? Being aware that children with disabilities are at a higher risk to be victims of sexual abuse, and thinking about the dynamics there that prevent disclosures. And if you've worked with one child on the autism spectrum, you've worked with one child on the autism spectrum. You can't say, well, this worked for this kid, this worked, so this will work for this kid. It's so individual and based on that child's needs and concerns. So having conversations with other folks about what might be effective, what might work well, thinking outside of the box, and that's something I'm very passionate about. And yes, again, that could be it is a whole nother training, but we don't want to forget these important dynamics that can make it harder for kids to tell. And being aware that kids sometimes do get those negative reactions. Half of the kids who disclosed sexual abuse in the study reported they were afraid or ashamed of what their parents might say. And in those cases, a lot of the parents did blame the child or act angrily. And so their willingness to disclose decreased when they experienced those negative reactions. The kids anticipated their parents' reactions well. So it isn't always about teaching kids to tell your parent. It's sometimes about teaching kids who are your people. I'm seeing their questions in the box, and I'm also seeing it's 10:50. So I'm going to try to get through we pause for a bunch of questions in the middle there. I'm going to try to get through as much of this content as I can, and then I will answer the questions. I'll stay past the time to answer the questions, but I'll respect people's time just because I talk a lot, making sure I'm still respecting the hour window here. So going back to the process, sometimes people being concerned that if recantations happened, that meant that the child wasn't telling the truth, and that's not the case. We have recantations in so many of the cases where abuse happened. It's just they have told, and now they're watching the impact of telling. They're watching their parent be upset with them. They're watching a loss of income from one parent. They're watching, and they just, it's done. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. I want life to go back to normal. So being aware that if a recantation happens, it doesn't mean that we need to reduce our services to that family. Being aware it's not an event, it's a process, and the process has hills and valleys. And so thinking about action steps, one of the action steps is thinking about ways we can support the caregiver who's not causing the harm. If the non-offending caregiver is supporting that child, that increases their disclosure rates, that increases their sense of feeling safe in their own body. When caregivers are not being supportive, it's often that they're in a relationship with the offender, they're a victim of domestic violence themselves, and the dynamics that are happening there. And so my colleague Rachel does a training specifically on supporting the non-offending parent, and that's, again, a whole nother webinar, a whole nother training, but to be thinking about that and the work that we're doing to increase kids feeling that they can live into their disclosures. A big part of that is helping with the parent who's not causing the harm. With kids, looking at it from their perspective, one of the big things is don't promise you'll keep it a secret. Don't promise you can fix it all. We don't know what reports will get screened in, which ones it won't. But, you know, help me understand. If you don't know the answer to the next question, tell me, you'll go find out. Do what you say you'll do. Some of those basic building of trust that child is attempting to rebuild. Prevention offerings, this is the study I was talking about. Victor Feigh, who's my colleague, was talking about this study yesterday. It just came out this week. This was one of the first studies that looked at a prevention program and then said, not only does this help with disclosure, but does it help with being able to substantiate abuse? And this study, looked at a specific prevention program called Think First and Stay Safe. And they were more likely to disclose abuse during their forensic interview, and then it in turn predicted significantly the substantiation. So thinking about those prevention offerings, what those might be. And I like to think about prevention kind of as like universal precautions. I don't know, it's not necessarily long-term prevention. I'm not magic. I don't think what I tell a kid when they're in second grade, they're going to retain in fifth grade. But I might catch that kid in second grade who raises their hand and say, well, I didn't know you could say no if it was your uncle. I thought you had to say yes. Some of those in-the-moment experiences, and then thinking about, you know, those universal precautions of everyone getting that information in case they're the friend who someone tells. One of the reasons disclosures can be difficult is that it's our adult sense and our kid sense of feeling like it's someone else's problem. Diffusion of responsibility is once everybody thinks someone else is going to do something about it. The bigger the group of people who know that something's happening, the less likely people help. So when we're thinking prevention, it's not just about hardening the target. That's the tip of the iceberg. We need to spread out our prevention work, find the people causing the harm and flip the script there. And that's important work that people do in therapy, that are the people who do sex offender treatment. That's important work. And then looking at who are the bystanders and how can we help bystanders become upstanders. And becoming an upstander doesn't mean going after the person causing harm. It means how can we support the target. The target's the least likely, I mean, I shouldn't say least likely, but it's like when I took driver's ed, they taught me how to carry my keys in my fingers so I could stab someone in the eye. I have never had to do that, but I, as a bystander, have checked in with folks to make sure that they're in a safe place when leaving a bar because of my concern, because those of us who do the work do stuff like that all the time, and our friends deal with it. But that sense about bringing that bystander, upstander, especially on behalf of kids. Helping kids form their safety net. Who are the 5 people you can tell if you have a problem? So if the person at home is the one causing the problem, we have someone else to tell. If the person we tell doesn't know how to help us, we have more people to tell. And that as we build those safety nets, being aware of paying attention of anyone who tries to separate us from our net. The 2 questions we teach when kids are very, very young for body safety, it's not do we know them or not, because it's almost always someone we know. Is this person trying to get me to break my body safety rules or my internet safety rules? Does this person give me a feeling in my stomach like something's wrong or they seem too good to be true? If the answer is yes to either of those, we want to check in with the person taking care of us. And so it's not do I know them or not, it's how are they making me feel, what are they asking me to do? And we as adults need to do that as well. I've known this person for 30 years. I don't care if you know them for 30 years. What are they asking you to do? What are they asking your kid to do? And so those 2 questions sort of being the start of safety conversations. Being aware, the more shared ownership we have, the better off we all are. I was at a youth ministry conference years ago by Youth Specialties, and I wish I remembered the speaker's name. He just talked about the danger of having a light bulb style of leadership, where you have one light in the ceiling and everyone flocks to that one light. And when that one light burns out or moves or gets fired or finds a different vocation or whatever it is, you lose all that energy and you lose everything that flocked to the light. that it's far better with leadership and any involvement to create track lighting, because the one light bulb isn't going to see everything. Not everyone feels comfortable going to the top of the top. And that burnout is much less when we have track lighting of lots of different people invested. And so thinking about in you, the groups that you serve and the communities that you come from, how we can share that responsibility, provide training to everybody so that everybody knows what to look for and is aware. So it's not just like a teacher can't say to the school social worker, I'm worried about this kid, can you call in and make the call? That's not how it works by law. It's the teacher calling it in. But the more that we can equip teachers, youth serving organizations, coaches, theater companies, to speak up when they see something on behalf of kids, the better off we all are. Kids who have been abused, and the resiliency research is so important, but be aware that I'm not saying here, children have experienced trauma, they can just bounce back right away. Kids are not bouncing balls by any means. We know kids who've experienced trauma and are still thriving or still resilient. When we look at resiliency research, one of the big pieces is did they have positive relationships with adults who didn't abuse them? You know, in academics and extracurricular activities, positive relationships with instructors. And then looking at other resiliency factors, you know, did they have a positive relationship with one non-abusive adult who cared about them? Because their mentality of no one loves me, no one cares about me, no one wants me to be safe starts to shift when they meet that one person who does. So if you're ever wondering if the work you do matters, if you are making connections in small and big ways with kids and letting them know that they're special and they deserve to be safe, we are in a better place than we were yesterday. Whew. That was a lot in a short time. I want to make sure that my email is here on your screen, as well as our crisis line and our website. We're a program of Zero Abuse Project, and Zero Abuse Project does provide a ton of different trainings, different people on our staff. If you want to get a copy of our latest training document with the things that we train on, let Mitch know in the chat bar, because we update that regularly if you just want to see the menus. Especially people who are currently writing grants this time of year. If you need a training partner, reach out to us and see how we can be helpful to you.